Alok, thank you so much for joining me. So tell us about the name of the book and why you chose that.
It was one of many names I batted around with my publisher, and it wasn't my first choice. I went along with it because it rhymes with honey trap. In the book, if you read it, there's an actual honey trap and attempt at sexual blackmail. So it was a play on that, but the reason wasn't necessarily my first choice. It's a little bit cliched, but what it refers to, obviously, which I think most people get, is money being a trap, or the pursuit of money being a trap. And most of my colleagues, particularly those who've been in the business for a while, Wall Street or technology investing or whatever, they kind of get it. They instantly know what that means because a lot of them are still in it.
So, and why is it a trap?
It's the allure of money. It's the oldest thing in the world. I mean, when you're caught up in the pursuit of money and it keeps going, it's just very easy to break free of that. I mean, there's always something more you can buy, right? I mean, there's always a bigger plane, a bigger home, and I repeat that many times in this book. Always something more, and that's not ideally the way it's supposed to work. I think our old Vedic philosophy understood this, and I think there's some very meaningful wisdom in the notion that there's stages in life, and at some point you really got to let go.
And you arrived there because you've experienced it, satiated yourself, and hit some kind of ceiling.
That once again is too cliched. Nobody does that, and I don't consider myself one of those like monk who gave up the Ferrari. I think that's without putting down anyone, I think that's a bunch of BS. For me, it was a case of being in a position where it just no longer made sense. I talked a lot about what I went through in my days at SoftBank or at Morgan Stanley, and they were all situations in which my position, it wasn't a happy place to be in. So there was a natural break point. But absent that, I mean, it's quite likely I'd be as trapped as a lot of my former colleagues in that money trap.
So I'm going to come to the book in a moment.
Yeah.
But the word trap again, I mean, just to spend a few more moments on that. You're saying that it's something that
it's self-imposed, if that's what you mean.
Yeah.
Nobody's holding a gun to your head saying you're going to stay in there.
Yeah. But then once
that's why it's interesting to write about, right?
Yeah. And in your case too, I mean, would you have left it had things not reached that point where you had to, let's say, leave that fund and you had to take another position? There was this whole smear campaign that was going on.
I think it's better than even chance, likely even that I would not have left. And that's exactly my point, right? I mean, I don't want to pretend to be, hey, I'm moving, I'm taking sannyas or whatever. I mean, it was very much a case of being in a situation where you've got this bizarre thing going on, which is enormously stressful. And it's very clear that from a, kind of Son-san, who I admire tremendously, still do, was kind of a bit of a different path from what I wanted to do or was focused on. It just made sense to part ways.
And in the book, I don't know how many secrets that you've revealed that you should not have revealed, but clearly you've revealed some, and many of them reflect obviously your proximity to Masayoshi Son of SoftBank, or Nikesh, who was earlier in Google and then went to Palo Alto Networks. So what made you write this? I don't know. Is it a tell-all? Is it tell somewhat or tell a little bit?
Well, I don't believe I've revealed any secrets.
Mm-hmm.
I was very careful about that, and I want to be very honest about that. Anyone who is buying this book or reading this book in the expectation that I'm going to spill the beans is probably going to be disappointed. Candidly, the appeal of this book, and I'm overwhelmed by the reception, is much more in the style of writing and my observations on events that are generally facts that are publicly known. When you leave a position such as mine, you always sign an NDA. I think most people appreciate that. Clearly, I don't want to be on the wrong side of that. So clearly, I've made an effort. I was very aware of not revealing anything that could be construed as confidential information. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
But from my perspective, there was always an awareness.
And yet you do bring out personality facets, including of Masayoshi.
The complexity of the individuals, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that to me, as a writing project, that's kind of what you focus on, which is not kind of positioning people as good or bad, not binary. That's very simplistic. Is to bring out their complexity. What I admire them for, what people admire them for, and not necessarily talking about it in that fashion, but just observing and describing their actions and their behavior, and let the reader judge for himself or herself what they make of this individual. Yeah.
So did you take up writing as a more formal project, including training yourself for it, because you wanted to write this book, or was the book the outcome of that?
No, it's a good question. The latter, very much the latter. I did not, I wanted to be, it's been a closet ambition for the longest time. I figured that the best way to pursue it, it was one of those like, it's already late, but it's not too late. And so I entered a graduate program at NYU, full-time MFA degree, which is quite demanding and a terrific experience. And as one does in an academic environment, in a student environment, I experimented a lot. I wrote all kinds of stories. And what resonated with people is I do have what people might describe as a writerly eye for observation. I mean, just coming into your studio or walking around, this is a really interesting neighborhood, right? Yeah. And I'm just stowing away pieces of information that at some point, maybe tonight if I have time, I probably won't. I'd love to. I don't have a diary, but I keep writing about things that I see, and that's something that I've always wanted to do, to be a writer. I mean, and as I experimented in college, kind of bringing out kind of with a writerly eye for observation some of the things, some of the situations I've been in, whether it's flying private or doing $50 billion deals. It's those are not situations one associates with aspiring authors and novelists. So we just made for an interesting, and when I managed to when I started to focus on that 5-year slice of life, which is what this book is focused on, I could manage to string that together as a narrative. And that's kind of how this book was born.
And does it have the kind of detail it has? For example, your meetings and who was sitting where and what wine was served, and so on, because you took notes later, or is it something that you've recalled during the process of writing?
A little bit of both. Keep in mind that some of the situations on San's dining room or a plane that I'm describing are situations, locations, scenes I've been in on multiple occasions. Right? I mean, I'm
like
not
Tokyo,
yeah,
Conrad.
Yeah, exactly. The Conrad Hotel, or the the double height reception room where the piano is, and how people behave.
The missing floor.
Yeah, exactly. The missing floor, exactly. And a master's dining room, over 100 times. So it is, that stuff is relatively easy. Some of it, you kind of jog your memory. You talk to people who are there with you. You ask them if they remember. Mostly they don't, because some of it is already 10 years old. Yeah. And, you kind of string it together and tell the story in a coherent way. But the idea is, you always want those details because you want the reader to feel that they're in the room. And that's a lot of the positive feedback I've had on the book, which is people feel as if they're in the room. Yeah.
Yeah, and sampling the wine, which I'm sure they can't afford.
Tasting, sampling, in some cases smelling, observing. Yeah, I mean, that's the as a writer, that's what you aspire to create.
Yeah. So tell us about Masayoshi Son, to someone who doesn't know much about him, or actually, let's assume he or she doesn't know anything about him, except that it sounds like someone who's big in the world of finance.
Yeah. The way he describes himself is probably the best way to understand him. He calls himself the crazy guy who lives in the future, or crazy guy who bets on the future. So he's a futurist in that term, futurist, visionary. It's used a little bit loosely in the Indian context. I don't know how many people you'd put in that category. Maybe Dhirubhai Ambani. I mean, there's only a handful of people, right? And they come along once every few decades, literally. So he's one of those people, right? He's iconic in that way, and he's proven that time and time again. Foreseeing the smartphone revolution, the internet disruption, and now AI, and betting big time, monumentally by any standards, on those disruptive changes in technology. So that's the most important characteristic. On a more personal basis, I found him to be charming, engaging, funny. We had a lot of fun together, a lot of laughs with him. The other more business characteristic, actually, maybe that should have come second. A lot of visionaries, you think that big picture people don't focus on the detail. His focus on as an operator on operating details can be microscopic. If there's I described this incident where there's a defect, a blind spot in Sprint, and Sprint was a phone company in the US that SoftBank owned, that there's a blind spot there. He will work with his engineers, identify it, go tell the Sprint people to fix it. That degree of focus is very unusual.
When you say blind spot, you mean somewhere where the
there's
signal
no
is not
coverage,
available.
there's no coverage, there's no signal, right? So that kind of focus is rare, or you don't normally associate that with people who you kind of think of as big picture visionaries. That's very unusual.
Because he was also an inventor and a technologist.
Yes, yeah, he has. I haven't got back and fact checked this, but if I'm not mistaken, used to be, I think the number was 350 patents, and it's probably more by now. But yes, I mean, he's a technologist in the true sense.
Now, one of the things that distinguished him is obviously his ability to take mega bets. When everyone else is talking about millions, he's talking billions. When they're talking billions, he's talking about tens or even hundreds.
Yeah.
How do you, coming from where you do, including in investment banking, how do you adjust yourself to that level of thinking, if you at all do?
No, that's a great question. And lots of times people ask me, why don't you hold him back? Or, because let's be fair.
And you tried.
The flip side of it is, if you look at Son San's history in investing, there was, to say the least, two major hiccups. One is he went too far in the year 2000 and documented in the Guinness Book of World Records, lost the most money ever, right? World record. And then again, I don't think his personal net worth declined by quite that much, but 2021 was a major, major setback for him, right? So he has gone too far, and he's publicly recognized, not even recognized, he's kind of self-flagellated himself for doing that, particularly the second time when he made some kind of fairly strident kind of public proclamations about how ashamed he was of having made these mistakes. So he has done that. But the flip side of it is, on the big stuff, he's been spectacularly right. It's a long-winded way of answering your question. Very often when people ask me that question, my response is, well, if I'd held him back, or if he'd listened to people like me, he probably wouldn't have done Alibaba. Arm is a deal I'm very closely associated with it. I was on the director by his side, setting management composition, setting strategy, etc. Great, but I would not have had the courage to buy Arm, because putting on my kind of nerdy banker hat on, analytical hat on, I would have said, look, it's already expensive. We're paying a control premium. I'm not convinced. And he never had any doubts. Look at what he's accomplished. It's a $100 billion mark-to-market gain. It's quite remarkable.
Now, what I would wonder from outside, which perhaps you also did, and you, I think, alluded to it in the book, this is the same person who invested in Arm, which obviously turned out right in hindsight as well, and also invested in Oyo, which was obviously something dramatic from your perspective, and so was it from the perspective of someone like Sequoia. So my question really is, how do those two things converge, even as a process of thinking? So from outside, I'm saying, okay, is there a method to this person's madness? Now, this doesn't seem to suggest method, or is there?
Well, let me put it this way. There isn't a method that you can copy. Like a lot of people ask me, what can you learn from it? You can learn a lot from Son San. Probably the number one takeaway for people out there is resilience, right? Just think about, there's this Icarus flying close to the sun metaphor. Everyone's familiar with that. Close to the sun, crashes, kind of flies again, crashes, and flying again higher than ever. That's remarkable resilience, right? So that's one thing. Life lesson, not just technology investing. We can all draw on, but you can't emulate someone like a Masa Son or a Steve Jobs. And there's an element of creative genius that just simply cannot be taught. Even as an investing method, there is a Warren Buffett way, there is a Sequoia way. Not to put down Sequoia, there's some fantastic, look at that track record. It's remarkable. There's some terrific technologists, but there is a method to their madness. They go about it in a traditional way. And if you're a young associate, it's an apprenticeship model. And if you're working alongside some of their great partners, you learn to think about things like, basic things like, not to suggest Son San doesn't, but you look at kind of size of the market, addressable market, product market fit, entrepreneur track record, is you dealt with failure, resilience, all those characteristics. You structure a deal in a certain way with tight governance, you drip feed capital based on achieving certain benchmarks, and you progress from one round to the other round. I mean, there's a method that's worked for them. And they know that of any 10 deals, like one might be a home run, and there are kind of going to be a bunch of duds, and there's a method based on experience in terms of where you focus your resources, right? I mean, so that's Son San's approach is very different. I say that in the book, that he looked at founders the way they want to be looked at a founder. So you gave the example of Oyo. I mean, his approach was, this guy reminds me of me when I was young. I'm all in. Tell me how much capital you need, and I will give you more.
5 times more.
I will give you more, right? And go after the opportunity. I believe in you. I'm not here to police you. I believe in you. So it's, in that sense, it's quite different. Now, there's teams at SoftBank, many of whom I know, and some of whom I've recruited and mentored. They're all terrific. They're every bit as good as partners at Sequoia or whatever. And they do things on a much more conventional basis, but on a smaller scale. What sets SoftBank apart, what SoftBank is all about, is these kind of amazing visionary bets, spectacularly big and mostly successful bets that Son San makes. I mean, that's what SoftBank's about.
And you also pointed out the interesting contrast that when you raise $100 billion, you can't all invest it in so-called future singularity projects or ventures.
Certainly not at the time. I mean, now
and you're really investing it in things which are much more common.
Yeah, now with AI infrastructure, maybe you can deploy that kind of money, right? I mean, because you look at Mukesh Ambani and his pronouncements recently in Bombay with Jensen Huang and building, these mega data centers. Now, there you're talking about real estate and these massive warehouses. And then on top of that, you buy real estate, you construct these data centers, and then very expensive infrastructure. That's where Jensen comes in these NVIDIA chips, right? Each chip can
Also
cost in the region of $40,000-$50,000, right? So I mean, that's massively capital. So if you had $100 billion to play with today, maybe you can think about it. But that's the curse of being a futurist. I mean, frequently you're too far ahead of your time.
And how, from your own meetings with Jensen Huang, how would you? How did you see him then? Versus, of course, now he's in the rock star category of.
He's the ultimate rock star. I mean, he even dresses like a rock star with that leather biker jacket, right? I mean, look, he again is yet another visionary. His story, which is fairly well known, but I talk about it in the book, is these GPUs, graphics processing units, which is what was used, still is, in video games. And he had the vision. And Masa saw it too, by the way, because the whole chip engineering architecture is very near and dear to his heart in terms of re-engineering those chips to make them general purpose graphic processing units. And saw that very early, and man, has he been successful. It's just been amazing to watch. And there isn't a competitor in sight.
Yeah. So if I were to ask you about now the landscape or the lay of the land, so when in the book that you write about, there was a certain wave of let's say companies that were tech led.
Yeah.
And you also talk about the funny side of it almost. I mean, a pizza company or
Zoom Pizza
or WeWork, which a normal person would struggle to fathom what's the technology in that. And yet they're positioned as technology companies, funds like yours were investing in them.
Yeah.
So let's say that was a phase.
Yeah.
What is the kind of phase that we're in today, if we are?
Yeah, I think if you're talking about 2021, which is probably the period of peak hype, 2 points I'd make. One is that was as much, if not more, a public market phenomena, right? I mean, I think the number of IPOs in 2021, second half of 2020, and then spilling over in 2021 is like north of 1,500, right? I mean, of which maybe 600-700 were SPACs, right? I mean, and a lot of those deals were disastrous, right? I mean, WeWork went public via SPAC, priced at $10, ended up bankrupt, which means equity's worth zero. So lot of accidents, and the market still hasn't recovered from them. India is a thriving IPO market. The US IPO market still hasn't recovered, right? So there isn't much by way of hype and excess in the public markets. High flyers like NVIDIA is not outrageously valued, right? If you look at a company...
Yeah, it's valued lower than a lot of Indian tech companies.
Yeah, but I mean, it's got the margins and it's got the growth.
Yeah.
You're not valuing a dream. It's real cash flow and real growth prospects and a fantastic macro trend. And it's got, by virtue of its technology, it's what Jensen described, and when he spoke in India, that CUDA layer of software that kind of people can build on and get hooked on, and not easy to break away from. So there are a lot of protective moats too. Not a competitor in sight. I don't believe those companies that kind of NVIDIA at 35, 40 times earnings is overvalued. Son publicly said he thinks it's a screaming buy. He thinks it's cheap, and you may well be right. But where you are seeing signs of hype, kind of what I call FOMO investing, is with private companies in the AI space. Artificial super intelligence. That's my favorite, because literally, one guy, I'm sure he's an extraordinarily bright individual, breaks away from OpenAI, where I believe he was the CTO, announces this company, and he instantly raises $1 billion at a $5 billion valuation, right? And the people clamoring to get in. And there are a lot of those. And, even with OpenAI is obviously much more established. Its profitability remains to be seen. It does have competitors. It's got an open source competitor, Llama, which is Meta's. So it remains to be seen how that unfolds. But the hype around that deal, even at $150 billion, is quite remarkable. I mean, the people who SPVs have been set up for investors to invest, were then selling secondary pieces at a premium. That's FOMO investing. There's a little bit of that going on.
So, of course, the principles of, let's say, excesses, I guess would remain with every cycle or every wave. So that, I guess, continues. So you're saying that world that we saw then, the investments...
We're not there yet. We're not there yet.
Okay.
I've seen...
Or we may never see that again?
No, of course we'll see them again. That's the one thing with certainty. Bubbles, when you're in them...
You don't know it is.
No. You can spot bubbles. I think, I've been in these markets for 30 years. I think I can spot bubbles. That doesn't mean I know how to trade bubbles, right? I mean, my favorite example of that is one of the... Most people would recognize him as, agree that he's one of the greatest investors of all time, Julian Robertson, right? And Julian identified the tech bubble, and he was right eventually. But by the time he was right, he was out of business because he just so hopelessly underperformed the market, I think for almost 2 years, that people just lost patience. And he himself, I don't know if he lost his conviction. I haven't talked to him, but that's the challenge of investing.
And do you invest yourself in public markets, including in countries like India?
Not with any degree of success, I have to say. Not on a personal basis. I play with things a little bit, but particularly at my age, it's much more kind of index funds and bonds and occasional private,
including in India.
Not that much in India. I haven't been that active in India. I'd like to be quite honest. I haven't spent as much time as I'd like to, and I'm very keen to do that in the coming months.
And I mean, are you naturally attracted to technology and technology-led sectors, or?
Only because I've worked alongside one of the greatest technologists and some extraordinarily bright people in the world of technology, my old friend Nikesh Arora, and have learned a thing or two, and still have connections in the Valley, and I still see a lot of flow. So yes, I am probably kind of over-indexed in terms of my interest in the world of technology, even from an investment perspective.
So. Your background, I mean, you're from Delhi and you grew up there, and both your parents were doctors?
Yes.
And how is that, you think that's made you, let's say, more careful? Because in the latter part of the book, you do express reservations about some of those investments and all that. Is that something that came naturally many years ago? Or is that something that you learned, let's say, in Wharton, or about how to be careful about investing? So really, I mean, is it a philosophy? Is it learned?
It's more a personality trait.
Hmm.
Some people are inherently, kind of exuberant risk takers. I'm not one of them. So I don't think it's much more complicated than that. And I think most people will relate to that. I mean, the people who genuinely enjoy gambling, I don't, right? And at some level, if you're trading in and out of financial markets, there is an element of gambling.
And you don't necessarily connect that with your growing up or where you come from and so on?
No, not really.
Okay.
Not really. I mean, it's there are plenty of people who come from very humble origins and who are, extraordinary risk takers.
So what is then risk taking? I mean, in all the people that you've met, including entrepreneurs, and you described Masayoshi Son, who's obviously the biggest risk taker of them all, at least as we know.
Yeah.
So how does one, I mean, is there a process to it? Is it purely something that you grew up with?
Well, there is trading instinct, personality traits. I think has a lot to do with the psychological aspects of trading. Son is very different in as much as when you think about Masa as a risk taker, you have to go back to the earlier statement I made, which is his self-characterization, which is, I'm a crazy guy who lives in the future. I'm a crazy guy who bets in the future. If you're living in the future, you're sort of reading tomorrow's headlines, right? It's not a lot of risk if you can read tomorrow's headlines, right? So the way, his risk return calculus is fundamentally different, not something you really want to copy. Beyond that, I don't have a lot original to say beyond what's been written in so many investment manuals, books already. But there's personality traits that come in. Daniel Kahneman, God bless him, is one of the most influential books I've ever read. He won a Nobel Prize for making the point that most individuals are risk averse. That people do not see the world as binary. The gain associated with a coin flip, making money $10 is not the same as the loss. If the coin lands the other way, losing $10, that hurts disproportionately more. That's how human beings behave. So that element of psychology, I'm very keenly aware of that, and it impacts my investment choices. And I think people need to kind of be aware of that when they make their own investment choices.
And are there examples where you felt you got something totally wrong or right, and only perhaps in hindsight because of the way you think about things? And maybe it's nothing to do with where you're from or how you grew up, but the way, let's say, you approach a certain problem statement or an investment thesis.
I tend to be fairly coldly analytical, and because I'm not taking flyers, I've lost money on deals plenty of times, but it's always been kind of on spec. If I'm venture investing, you sort of assume that there's a maybe a 10% chance that it flies, and you just hope you've made enough bet that some of those will kind of come good. And I've got more than my fair share wrong, so I can't really come up with any single. I don't have any precious nuggets to kind of give you in that regard.
Of things you got wrong.
Well, or spectacularly right. There's plenty I got wrong, but kind of give you the type of insight you might be looking for.
So when you got something wrong, would it be because you misread the entrepreneur? I think you quoted examples, for example. I'm not saying they were, you signed off on them, but there were companies where the entrepreneurs clearly, were up to something. There was problems in their accounts and so on. So that's one kind. The other is where the business itself just doesn't hold and it collapses because maybe there was just there was too much air pumped into it.
Yeah, that happens all the time. Too much air pumped into it. WeWork is the poster child for that, right? And Masa's public statement was, God bless him for saying this. Very few people have the humility to say this. He said, I may be as guilty. In fact, he might have said, I may be more guilty than Adam Newman for that outcome. So, you give a company too much money, and Adam, as a real estate business, he was onto something. Millennial choices with respect to how people work, how they live. That's a legitimate trend, and creating a real estate model that caters to that is fundamentally sound. Where, of course, that went wrong is it should never have been valued as a technology company. and he was definitely giving too much capital, too much leeway. And but the amazing thing about Adam Neumann is he's back, and he's being backed to do much of the same thing, and he's being backed by technology investors. Which is strange credibility for me, but it's happening. It's very real. Yeah.
And I'm sort of, in a way, coming back to that question, that the when you start infusing technology or adding a technology layer to things, and I thought that was a phase that's gone, but and you're really saying that that phase is not gone, because people are still able to do that. I mean, create a technology veneer and then position it as
Adam's one of a kind. I'm not sure anyone. I'm not. It was remarkable what he pulled off in the first place. Even more remarkable that he's been able to pull off again. There's a side of me that he did nothing wrong. He did nothing illegal. I don't believe he did anything immoral. Okay, I just want to be very clear about that.
Yeah.
And there's a side of me that just admires him for the sheer audacity of being able to do this, not once, but twice, bouncing back. And, can I wish him luck?
When you wrote this book, were you thinking of, is this the one story that you wanted to write about? Is there something else that you...
I want to write lots of stories. I want to write fiction. They're much easier to write. You have a lot less accountability. You don't have to worry about how you describe people, how the way, they might react, whether you're in keeping with your NDAs, etc. So fiction, you have a lot more freedom. You can exaggerate, right? I mean, the beauty of this story, real story, is some of the things were so wild you would stretch to kind of make it up, right? So in that sense, this book was lend itself to a nonfiction type, business type thriller. But no, to answer your question, I do want to write fiction. That's where my interest is.
And would that be in the realm of finance, banking?
It probably will
business?
Pick up elements of that, because as a writer, you're always at your best when you're you're always most credible when you're drawing on your own experiences. And since mine are skewed towards the world of finance and technology, I suspect that will have a lot to do with it. And I should say the world of writing, because being immersed in that world was just an enormous late life learning experience for me.
And amongst my last couple of questions, so I'm sure there are people like you in your world, and I met a few of them as well, who want to write about their world, which is striking deals, maybe the private jets, going to Turkey for a deal, coming back the same day for a family function. It sounds quite glamorous, but as you've concluded, maybe it isn't after a point. But what would you advise them? I mean, would you say write your story, or?
I never read those stories because I don't read nonfiction generally. I actually don't read books written by people like me. I'm not doing a very job of promoting my own books, but to be quite honest, most of the time they tend to be boring. They tend to be self-aggrandizing.
Yeah.
And who knows, maybe people will say that about my book. But no, I mean, unless you've got unless there's something more that you have to say about life, don't bother. And to me, the most meaningful feedback I get, one of the reviewers made the point, which I think is exactly the right way to think about my book. My book is not binary. I'm not telling you that all the things I did were great. I'm not telling you should be like me, or look at me, I was so cool. Maybe that's what you take away from it, but that says something about you.
No, but you end with Tolstoy.
But I end on a fairly philosophical note, which is, and then coming back to the critique, it was actually in The Economist made the point that, but this could equally be the point is equally the vacuousness of the pursuit of money, right? And so it's not as cool as it seems, and kind of make your own conclusions. It is not binary. I'm not binary in terms of how I talk about people there. People will make their own conclusions.
Yeah.
There'll be people who love Son-san, admire him as I do, and then other people who think he's a reckless gambler. You decide.
No, and you end with Tolstoy, which is, coming sort of full circle.
How much land does a man need?
Yeah,
exactly. And that's kind of ties into the money trap. And to the extent there's a theme to that book, it's a little bit. To the extent there's a message that people should unpack, it's that. As opposed to, look, this is so cool, or any of that. Even when I'm in a plane, the reason I describe that, there's a point to that, which is, as cool as it is to be in a G550, most people who are in that situation are thinking about, oh my God, look at the dude next door. He's got a G650. And that's the money trap.
Yeah. And I think you talk about how Masayoshi Son has a bigger, newer aircraft.
So there's always someone with something that, kind of is bigger, or flies faster, or, lasts longer, or whatever. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Alok, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
so
It's
much.
a good note to end on. Thank you.